The ridge was a jagged scar of red dust and obsidian, a natural wall that should have been the Terran battalion's grave. 10,000 Korvathi warriors sat in the canyons below, fur rippling like a gray tide, waiting for the howl that would signal the end. At the center of the human line, a single Terran commander sat in a folding chair, staring at the horizon with an unnerving, vacant intensity. He wasn't reaching for a weapon, and he wasn't calling for a retreat. He was simply waiting. What happened next? I wish I could say it ended there. Stay close. The heavy silence was a weight I hadn't prepared for when I accepted this provisional commission. 3 rotations ago, the hardest decision I'd faced as a newly appointed siege lead was whether to authorize extra rations for the scouts. Now, I was staring at a human trench through a long-range tactical lens, trying to reconcile our intelligence with the mundane reality of their defense. I want to be clear that I followed every protocol, including the thrice-verified orbital scans that confirmed no reinforcement ships were within 10 light-years. I was about to recommend a standard flanking maneuver when the tactical map flickered. It was a small glitch, a momentary blur in the feed. Beneath the observation deck, something shifted. I remember thinking that my data pad felt heavier than it had a moment ago, which was an absurd thought, but my brain was latching onto anything to avoid the readout. We had them cornered. Well, we had their physical coordinates locked, but the how of their survival remained a jagged mystery. In the center of the human trench, perched on a command chair that looked like it had been salvaged from a scrap heap, sat a small child's shoe. It was white, laced, and tied with a neat bow, looking entirely out of place amidst the scorched earth and artillery casings. I focused on it for longer than was professionally appropriate. My mate had sent a message about our youngest's first molt ceremony, and seeing that tiny human object made me think of the reply I still hadn't finished. The humans were finally moving. They weren't prepping missiles or charging plasma coils. Instead, they were uncovering long, skeletal rails of dull metal that looked ancient, almost primitive. I laughed. In my defense, so did the rest of my bridge crew. We stopped laughing at different times. The preliminary analysis suggested that the humans' weaponry was, the scanner screamed. It wasn't a standard alert. It was a high-frequency resonance that set my canine ears ringing and made the fur along my spine stand rigid. The data readout from the long-range thermal scanners, which I had calibrated 3 times because the energy spikes in the human sector looked more like solar flares than infantry support weapons, suggested a total lack of conventional chemical propellants. These weren't cannons, they were electromagnetic accelerators. Science Division had warned us that Terran railgun projectiles experience forces exceeding 60,000 Gs during launch, a localized gravity event so violent it would compress a Korvathi body into a dense paste. The humans hadn't built weapons, they had weaponized the fundamental laws of kinetic energy. I submitted the emergency reclassification form with hands I couldn't keep still, and for some reason I was also furious about the canteen running out of bitter root. So I'm standing there, and the wind is howling, and the humans are just eating. One soldier was unwrapping a foil-wrapped ration while leaning against a rail that was currently drawing enough power to dim the lights of a small moon. My ears flattened against my skull. An involuntary low whine escaped my throat, a biological betrayal of the siege-led title I'd worked so hard to earn. The humans weren't digging in to survive. They were digging in to inform us of our mistake. The hum grew from a teeth-rattling vibration into a roar that seemed to vibrate the very marrow of my bones. I checked the atmospheric density readings on my primary console. For the record, I checked them twice. It shouldn't have mattered for simple kinetic slugs, but I needed something to do with my hands to keep the tremor from becoming a professional liability. My junior officer, who I later noted for a lack of composure in my log, was physically vibrating. His fur standing so rigid, he looked twice his actual size. The human commander stood up. He walked to a battered comm unit with a casual slow-motion gait that suggested he was unaware of the 10,000 Korvathi warriors currently tracking his heartbeat. To the Korvathi forces, the broadcast crackled. The voice was a dry Terran rasp, devoid of the panic I had spent 3 rotations expecting to hear. I looked at the evacuation ships lifting off in the far distance, small, flickering embers of hope against the deepening blue of the canyon sky. They weren't running, they were merely leaving. If I failed to break this line before the final ship cleared the thermosphere, the High Pack would revoke my seniority before my offspring even finished their first academic hunt. I noticed a small grease stain on my left sleeve. I spent nearly 10 seconds wondering if it had come from the morning's bitter root infusion or a faulty seal on the bridge door before the human spoke again. The tactical probability of a single battalion holding a ridge well, it wasn't a probability. And now, back on that jagged ridge of red dust, the commander finally moved. He didn't reach for a holster or a surrender flag. He reached for a handheld transmitter and adjusted the gain with a steady thumb. "Earth doesn't negotiate," he said, his voice flat and final. "Earth informs." The rails flashed. There was no thunder, no explosion, just a series of cracks that sounded like the sky itself was being torn in half by a celestial predator. Solid tungsten rods, traveling at over 6 times the speed of sound, hit our front lines before the light of the electromagnetic discharge had even reached my tactical sensors. Our armored carriers, built to withstand orbital bombardment and reinforced with heavy plating, didn't explode. They shattered. They disintegrated under a kinetic force that defied every defensive calibration in my database, proving that Fact 112 was not the propaganda I had claimed it was in my last quarterly briefing. So the rods hit and the hulls break, and suddenly I'm realizing that my battalion is not a battalion anymore. It is just a list of names for a report I won't survive to file. The guidance systems, which I had previously assumed were a theoretical exaggeration by the Terran Ministry of Defense to inflate their tactical worth, adjusted the flight paths of the rods even under the 60,000 G acceleration of launch. My armor plates locked, involuntary. My ears flattened so hard against my skull they ached, and a high-frequency resonance began to emit from my throat a sound of pure, biological distress. I was compressing myself into a ball on the floor of the bridge, my fur standing like needles as the ridge below vanished in a cloud of supersonic debris. The child's shoe was gone, presumably pulverized by the back pressure of the launch or carried into the upper atmosphere by the sheer displacement of air. I looked at the horizon through the cracked view screen. The evacuation ships were gone. Earth had informed us. We were a dead army on a jagged scar of red dust.